kick us off tonight while folks are joining. I'm Cyan, my pronouns are they, them, and I am from Chevalier's Books, the oldest bookstore in Los Angeles. Chevalier's is the host for this wonderful event, and we are also the local bookseller that is going to be selling signed book plates and the editions for this book release for Brent. So keep an eye out for that because I'll be dropping the link where you can purchase the book tonight, disruption proof, so that you can get your own copy. Hopefully we don't sell out, or maybe we do. We already sold quite a few. I think we sold like 5 or 6 already, and the event hasn't even started. So yeah, so it looks like people are rolling in now. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We're here to celebrate New York Times bestselling author Brant Cooper's newest publication, Disruption Proof. Discussing the book with Brant is Drew Falkman, who is an experienced iconoclastic leader in digital innovation and transformation, something very, very related to Brant's work. It's been a really rough year or so for businesses, especially somebody working for a local bookstore. I've seen a lot of it firsthand, and especially for like the people that these small businesses serve. So we'll get into how Brant has approached these issues. But first, I want to let y'all know that you can submit questions using the Q&A function. It's at that bottom bar. Since we are in a webinar, you can just write and submit your question in there. And then nearing the end, so like after maybe we've talked about the book for maybe like 45 minutes, we'll start rolling in those questions right around the end so we can get to those. Also, if you have any friends or family or just like interested folks who weren't able to make it tonight, we will be doing a recording of this Zoom, and then we will post it to our YouTube channel, and I'll share it with everybody so that we can send it out. Now to you, Brant and Drew, for the book talk.
Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. And Brant, it's nice to see you again.
Great to see you too, Drew.
So I think the best place to start is, let's just talk about the world and where we are and how this book came to be. Because obviously a lot's happened in the last couple of years. So, what was the inspiration for this book and how did it happen?
Yeah, thanks. I point out, and a matter of fact, I think I even write it in sort of an author's note at the beginning of the book that I didn't set out to write a pandemic book, and I wouldn't really describe it as a pandemic book. But when you write a book during the pandemic, it's almost impossible to keep that out. And of course, I wouldn't want to purposely keep it out. But basically, I've been spending the last 8 years, grew a company that was trying to teach this entrepreneurial spirit to large established companies. And we started out 2014 mostly in the innovation groups, which seems like the reasonable place to start. You go where the people are trying to create new products that will emerge at some point in the future. And being a big fan of Clayton Christensen and The Innovator's Dilemma, I was pretty bought into the idea that companies knew what they had to do for most of their markets, and so they should be in execution mode, but they also needed to plan for the future and these products that would be needed in the future as existing products sort of went through the natural wane in their markets over time. But I think the most fundamental thing that I learned over the last 7 or 8 years is that uncertainty exists throughout the enterprise, and that innovation groups are often underfunded, not because leadership isn't bought in or they don't get it. It's because the big companies are struggling even in their core markets, that there's a lot of uncertainty just even in their marketing and their selling and their product features and all of these other parts of their core business. And so I set out to write a book that was really, how do you bring that entrepreneurial spirit and why you should bring the entrepreneurial spirit to the whole business, to everyone. Now, not everybody will apply it to the same degree, but wherever there's uncertainty, you can't just do the way you've done it before. You can't just use best practices to get through uncertainty, because best practices are for execution mode. It's for when you know, and uncertainty is when you don't know. And so that was the purpose of the book. And then the pandemic, right? And so then you've got the core part of businesses, big businesses, small businesses, startups, the core foundational things that they thought they knew were no longer true. And I think for a lot of companies, that was really difficult because they didn't know how to deal with the unknown. And so that's what the book is about, is how do you deal with the unknown, and how do you create organizations that are prepared for future unknowns and the unknowns that exist today. And so I, came up with a couple of frameworks. There's, create these rad businesses so that they're resilient, aware, and dynamic, and a mindset that's needed by everybody inside the organization in order to apply entrepreneurial spirit wherever they face this uncertainty.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you think of disruption proof, whenever people think of sort of like mitigating risk, we always think of like sort of shielding ourselves like a roly-poly, and like that's how we're going to survive this, but it's going through your book, it's not about that at all. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's about sort of embracing that, but then being smart about how you approach it. So I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, that's a great point. Let me just jump in there because it's the what you have to do to be this entrepreneurial spirit is you actually have to admit when you don't know. But the 20th century mindset, sort of that command and control hierarchy, you got to the top of the company because you're an expert. And so admitting that you don't know something runs counter to sort of that management philosophy. And so that's really where the big companies have this issue, right? I think startups are more naturally inclined to understand that, right? And to run experiments and to try to figure it out. But if you reach the top of a Fortune 500 company because you're supposed to be in the know, and then you face this massive uncertainty, and the answer is that you have to admit that what you don't know, that becomes a tough nut to crack.
Yeah, totally. And some industries are, that like what is a lot more entrenched, right? That people really, the whole foundation is built on assumptions, and those industries got hammered in the last couple of years. I shouldn't laugh because it was brutal probably for them, but
right.
So I mean, maybe you can talk. So when you talk about the Rad framework, right? It's resilient, aware, dynamic. I get aware. Aware is just like paying attention, right? Knowing what the market conditions are. That's how you can sense changes. Resilient and dynamic seem sort of opposing. Like how do you balance that in an organization?
Yeah, well, so what I think about when I use the word resilient is a it's a tropical tree, right? It's a palm tree that faces extraordinary storms, and so it bends in the wind. Yet there's power in that bending, right? So it doesn't break, it doesn't fall away into the sea. It actually it's built to withstand fundamental change. So aware, as you say, I'm aware of market condition changes, but I'm also aware of a ship stuck in a canal that's disrupted my shipping, my supply chain. It's an energy grid collapse. It's a ransomware attack. I mean, I think that what the pandemic represents is that these disruptions are just going to continue to roll through society and across the economy. And so we have to be attuned to what's actually going on in China, that first experienced the pandemic, and factories were actually closing down there. And so you have to be sort of built to be aware of those things. And then the dynamic part is, can we change our plans based upon that new information? If all you do is receive new information, but you don't change anything, then you're not going to survive either. And so the dynamic part is, how do we build this flexibility in? How do we build the ability to change our plans based upon new information? And of course, you're in product design and understand software development, and the term agile really comes from the Agile Manifesto, where a group of software professionals were, hey, how do we build that sort of agility into the way we build and design software? Because we can build so much of the product, but we can also pause, take in new information, and change based upon that new information. And so I think that that's something that, leaving aside for a moment, the implementations of specific flavors of Agile, the manifesto, the principles themselves, I think need to go company wide. It can't just be in engineering and R&D. And those principles make us able to respond to those changing conditions. And that is what makes us resilient, but it has to be built into the structure of the company. It's not, you know, a ransomware takes out a healthcare system in San Diego. Now is not the time to choose whether you're going to be resilient or not. It has to be built, ingrained into the culture and into the structure of the business itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at every level, interdepartmental,
and maybe even, you know, the last towards the end of the book, it's maybe even then, you know, are we structured properly? Like, do we need departments the way we've normally thought of departments? My argument is that those actually come out of the assembly line, right? That structure is an extension of Henry Ford's, or the science of management, Taylor's assembly line structure. The white collar departments inside the headquarters are simply an extension of the assembly line. And I think that very structure leads to not being customer centric. So not being aware and not being agile, because you have these rules of engagement that are built up inside of the departments, and the departments are not even allowed to communicate with each other. And everything becomes, you know, based upon calendars and all of these future plans that then don't make it, we're not able to change them because of the rigidity in that structure.
Yes. I mean, when I was doing a lot more consulting, definitely worked with organizations that had, you know, the center, like oftentimes, and I don't mean to villainize them, but PMOs that kind of sit there in the middle of the organization and control everything that's happening, and they become a mediator. And they get caught onto timelines and just shipping versus being dynamic. And I think that's a tough shift, I think, for a lot of organizations.
Well, I mean, it's sort of the $1 million question. I mean, it really is a difficult shift, but I guess I think that this is a fundamental change that's happening from the industrial age to the digital age. Everybody calls their ages, you know, something different, but to me, this is fundamentally going from, you know, a rigid industrial process. And one can think about, again, Henry Ford's assembly line. You're manufacturing, you know, Model Ts. You can have them in any color as long as they're black. It's sort of a famous quote that it's attributed to him. And if you look at the opposing side, like sort of the epitome of the digital revolution, what you have are, you know, it's Instagram, right? It's this instant gratification for consumers, and consumers are participating. They're generating the content, and they're, you know, or the digital fabrication is even another example of that, where it's like infinite customization in the moment of production. And those are sort of these bipolar opposites. And so if you think about a company that's structured upon that Model T assembly line versus how a company might be structured when you're doing digital fabrication and the product is instantaneously customized based upon the whims of the consumer, you know, you would think that, you know, the structure of the company is going to be fundamentally different. And yet, you know, I'm not sure that we've internalized that. I'm not sure we've grokked that. And it's a useful thought experiment, I think, for leadership to go like, well, if I'm looking at my digitized products now, or I'm looking at my digital infrastructure, even all of the back office functions, ERP systems and supply chain management, if I look at all of those things and I look at my company as a whole, and I was to reorganize it based upon that technology, based upon those processes that are optimized for the digital world, how would I structure my company? And it's not necessarily that you then go out and do it the next day, but it's an interesting thought experiment, because I don't think it would be, you know, okay, well, the logical thing to do would be to group people by function. I think that the other element that causes a lot of the uncertainty is just complexity. And so when consumers have computers in their pockets and they're able to change their mind, and they've got all sorts of options they can customize, and they have choices among different vendors, you know, the world is just a more complex place. And the way that you deal with complexity is diversity and it's decentralized decision making. And it's, again, it kind of gets back to that word of being dynamic and being agile, able to respond to the whims of those that are actually making the decisions now. And so I think that the structure of the company changes if people look at it from that perspective.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking internally, like, okay, wait, so this is a book about innovation, but you haven't said anything about creating new products. And I feel like innovation has been so focused, like lean startup and everything, on like shipping a new product, launching a new product, adding new features, creating all this. And what you're talking about has, I mean, maybe that's part of it, but you haven't even mentioned anything about new products. So I think that's going to blow some people's minds.
Well, I think, it's, I feel like almost I've been kicked out of the innovation circuit, because I just I'm so tired of the word, and it's so overused, and it means so many different things to different people, and organizations don't stop to define it. And so they're all running around using the word innovation, and they all mean something different. The CTO is talking about new technology. The marketing people are talking about just sort of the brand. The HR is talking about, open seating plans and scooters in order to recruit young people. So it's really a book about mindset, and a lot of people's minds go to technology when you're talking about innovation, and digital transformation has become the same thing. I mean, people just jump to like, well, what's the mobile app we're going to build? And it's really a legacy, I think, of when technical risk was the primary risk. And that was true back in the industrial age. It was true, up through the 80s and 90s and emerging internet technology. But I sort of marked the end of that era as being 2007, when, algorithms that human beings couldn't understand helped collapse Wall Street. Sort of marked the end of that sort of industrial age and beginning of the dominance of the digital age. And technical risk isn't the primary risk anymore. We kind of know that we can build it. Now, sure, in healthcare, obviously, and in, life sciences, and you're a big blockchain guy. So there's algorithms, there's emerging technology that's going to be important. But for most companies, the technology is going to be proven by somebody else, and they don't have to worry about invention. What they have to worry about is the application of technology and whether their customers care and whether their customers will benefit. It's how do I create value out of this technology rather than focusing on the technology itself. And so it requires a deep understanding of customers. It's market risk is the primary impediment, I think, to big businesses these days, to most businesses these days, rather than the technical side. But everybody wants to go to the technical side. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just sexier.
It's really interesting. So, and I've actually never thought of it this way. So I'm glad that you brought this up, because I think previous people were always talking about like the first industrial revolution, the second industrial, the third. But what happens is when you like lay it, so yeah, okay, when there's electricity, obviously, if you don't automate things, then like you're going to go out of business if you're still doing things with horses and someone else is automating, right? And then the internet comes and mobile phones. But at this point, like all these technological changes are bringing on layer 2, layer 3 changes, cultural things, the ability to work from home because this technology sort of enables that and empowers that, the ability for, how we commute places and how we move around and move things around, like that all changes. And so you have, because of these technologies, it's not about the technology. We're not waiting for the next best thing, right? That we're all then going to have to adopt. It's more like all these things have happened, and the waves of ripples of what the effects they've had are now fundamentally changing everything, and everything needs to be completely rethought. That's got to be really unsettling for, 100-year-old companies or even enterprise companies that just aren't as agile to shift.
I think it's unsettling for society.
I
actually think, and I don't have a lot of evidence for this, and I'm not an academic, but I actually think a lot of the turmoil in the world right now really is about this fundamental shift in society that's brought around by brought in by this digital revolution. And again, I think that, our brains are sort of wired about sharing disinformation across the back fence. It's like, I'm aging myself here, but it's Aunt Louise and her neighbor, and they're trading conspiracy theories across the back fence in their small village, right? That's our brains, how we're wired. And instead, what we've got today is tech companies that are optimizing the spread of that disinformation. So it's not like the invention of disinformation and all of that stuff that didn't come about because of the digital revolution. It's accelerated and amplified by the digital revolution. And so I think that just sort of is fundamental. And so even things in society, I think, are going to have to change in order to deal with that. And it's I think it brings a lot of fear and anxiety, right? So the uncertainty, complexity, not knowing what's coming, things that continue to ripple through our society, I think it creates fear. And I think that there's a lot of what's going on in the world is caused by that right now. And I just wish we had, maybe more leadership or people that were able to express that so that we can, start getting to the old root causes, right? And we like to tinker on the edges, and we're tinkering out here, and it feels like we're playing with a zero-sum game. We're robbing Peter to pay Paul. And if we actually were able to focus on systemic changes, they're sort of, I don't know, less they're less emotionally dangerous. And so what we do is you tweak in the system a bit, and you can get closer to what the desired outcomes are. And then there's sort of these battles that aren't out on the edge. But so, yeah, I don't know. All of that is it's probably over my pay grade, but it's I think it's interesting. And I just think that I've got a conference coming up called Endless Disruption Summit. And we're going to bring in people from healthcare, and bring in people from education, and bring in people from government that are actually changing in similar ways to what we're talking about inside of businesses. And I think it sort of represents that this change is way bigger than just business; it's societal, and it's an interesting time to be alive, to be in the middle of this massive change.
Yeah, there's, I think to that end, a lot of people end up going to sort of that fear, right? Like uncertainty mostly inspires fear in most people, let's be honest. And all of us, to some degree, depending on the nature of the uncertainty. But there are certain people that really thrive in that, and they see opportunity in that.
Yep.
So, and I think part of that is understanding how to sort of tackle the beast, right? So, how do you really mount this uncertainty and ride it like a horse, right? Instead of letting it run you around or being, a wild, untamed animal. And,
Well, I think it's a good question, because there, not to channel the late Donald Rumsfeld, but I mean, there's uncertainty that we can do something about, and then there's uncertainty that we can't do anything about. And so step one is to sort of separate those things out, right? Because the uncertainty that we can do something about, and really that's where we apply this RAD mindset. With that uncertainty, we're actually going to make ourselves feel better and be less anxious if we take care of the uncertainty that we can control. And so we're going to go and, it gets back to admitting what we don't know, which, requires vulnerability and self-awareness. And then we have to go out and learn, right? So we're willing to learn, we're willing to explore, we're willing to admit that best practices don't work anymore in this particular domain of uncertainty. And so we're going to go figure that out. And that actually makes us feel better. And then there's uncertainty that we can't predict. And those are, acts of God and storms and maybe, economic things. Maybe it's a ship getting stuck in a canal. Maybe it's the pandemic. But we can prepare for those things. right? We can actually create redundant systems. We increase our awareness so that we're able to respond quickly to those things. So there's things that we can do to even prepare for the uncertainty that we really can't control. And I think that one of the parts of the industrial age that is sort of the legacy of the industrial age that we need to change is this idea that we need to manage our companies to financial efficiency. And so again, going back to that Henry Ford example, if we're producing one car and we know that we can produce that car at a low enough cost that the middle class can buy the car, then again, it's really more around operational risk and technical risk and not the market risk. And so we're going to manage to get the most output for the amount of input that we put in there. So that's the industrial age. And then if you look at this digital age again, and that's not how purchases are made, we need to offer all of these different options, and we have to compete against, globally, and we have to compete against the whims of consumers that it can change their minds at any moment. And they've got all sorts of choice. They've got a lot of power in choosing. So then we shouldn't be measuring the efficiency of the company based upon how much output we can create versus the amount of input, because then we're just going to have a bunch of product that maybe nobody wants. So we created all that product really efficiently, but nobody's buying it. Well, that's not going to work. And so we need to start measuring efficiency based upon the efficiency of value that we've created for consumers. In other words, the consumers are liking and satisfied and maybe even passionate about the products that they're getting, then that's a different way of measuring efficiency. And if we start doing that, then the company itself will start optimizing itself. It's kind of the way human beings are. We optimize what we measure. If we start optimizing towards the value that we're creating for our stakeholders, a lot of the problems, I think, actually start going away. And what that means in terms of the uncertainty we don't control, it means that, hey, listen, if a ransomware takes out a hospital, we have to have a redundant system so that we can continue to provide care. If a supply chain goes out because of a ship in a canal, that means that we have to have alternative supply chains. And those are things that if you looked at them from purely a financial perspective, you're not going to do, because it's all just overhead cost that's not put into use. But if you think about it in terms of creating value, then you might create those redundancies, because you know that these ripples of disruption are happening all the time, and we want to be able to continue to create that value during those disruptions. So I think that there's ways to deal with it. And if we were going for that, if we were thinking about that type of efficiency, and we were trying to create value in the world and optimizing and competing based upon value, I think that actually also, again, sort of lessens the anxiety, because we'll feel like we have some of those things taken care of and planned for.
Yep, that makes total sense. Yeah, it's fascinating to see how different organizations respond to crisis. I've watched, just in the last week, two things have happened in my life simultaneously. On the one hand, my son went back to school after a long weekend with LAUSD, which is like the largest school district in the country. And I would argue the most mismanaged, but I've got some opinions on that. But so the first week of school, because of COVID, we have this daily pass. So all the kids get tested, and then you have to check off that they don't have symptoms and all this. And then you have a QR code, and then they let the child in. Well, the first day of school, the first week of school, the servers went down because everyone came at the same time at drop-off time. Everyone went to load up their pass. They did not plan for that at all. But things started working again. I assumed because their IT had gotten a handle and had added some sort of scaling into their system. Well, after this long holiday weekend, guess what? Parents weren't prepared. So what I realized is it was all about, parents were like, oh, I don't want that to happen. So they were doing it before breakfast, in the morning before they left the house. Once again, everything went down. And then the flip side is, there's this blockchain that I've been building an app with the team called Stacks. It's built around Bitcoin. They had this mempool situation where their blockchain got clogged with traffic. And they worked so quickly. They had, within, I think, 36 hours, they had pushed a new wallet so that you could, with a workaround, and then within 5 days, they had done something so that all the miners updated their software. And they have a massively distributed, decentralized, organization they had shipped this out to, and yet they were so much more dynamic than LAUSD. And I feel like, it's just a matter of, I don't know, the 5 E's kind of come to mind that you talk about. They're listening, they're empathetic to who their people are. They have that sort of attitude of like, let's explore possibilities and how can we do it? I mean, they're just sort of embodying all that stuff that you talk about.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, to be fair, government and
it's different. It's not a fair comparison.
I think that, I mean, you're right that they should go there. But in a lot of ways, it's us, the constituents, that need to sort of get them there, right?
That's true.
It takes money, and it also takes us understanding that we need that sort of dynamics. I mean, I'd be sort of surprised if most corporates or other large institutions would have been able to handle that as well, and they have very sophisticated IT.
Agreed.
And so so I mean, I think to me it's like it's difficult to blame tight budgets and all that kind of stuff, but I think that you're exactly right in the sense that to me that's the new normal, and so there's sort of not a choice that we have to go there. So I think that the end goal that you're painting there is exactly spot on, and I'm not sure, to be honest, how we get there. But I think that it's that people focus too much on technology rather than, sort of this more general of like, where do we need to be and where do we need to recognize that this type of disruption might happen? And so what does that require and how do we fund it? I think there's an example in the book of the city of Hayward, and the city of Hayward, for whatever reason, just, to me, the city manager that's there now, Kelly McAdoo, and her boss previously adopted a lot of what we call this sort of entrepreneurial spirit years ago, 5-6 years ago. And they go out and they talk to their constituents and they run experiments and they try to figure things out. And it's really extraordinary. And so what happened when COVID hit? This is a city that is completely surrounded by Silicon Valley, and Hayward itself is not a wealthy community, right? And so they're surrounded by, I don't know, the elite of tech, right? Where we all think it's happening and they're all so forward and they're all out in advance. And it's this small little city of Hayward that had practiced this entrepreneurial spirit for years and years and years, and COVID hit. And within 2 or 3 weeks, they had the first free testing site in the country up and running for COVID. I mean, it was absolutely extraordinary. And it happened because the fireman, I don't recall his name, but I mean, he went to McAdoo and said, listen, we just have a couple of paramedics that just, were exposed to COVID. We have no way of testing them, so they can't come in, and now we're short on this. And I think I should spin up a testing site. And Kelly McAdoo just said, go do it. And so we went and did the research, and within 3 weeks, it's up and running. And there's like these amazing videos on the website of, cars lined up for miles waiting for people to get tested. And this is still in the March of 2020. And so to me, this is an example of, I mean, again, a government, you would think, all of the normal hurdles that they would have to go to, and they had within 3 weeks a testing site set up, and just absolutely extraordinary. The whole county ended up relying on it because of how quickly they got it up. And I think it's just an example of being resilient, aware, dynamic, and they took care of it. And I think that is an ethos that we can bring to government and to education and to small businesses and to startups. And I think that, it'll actually lessen the turmoil if we go out and start taking care of business in all these institutions, because people will see that their tax dollars are going to somewhere that actually creates value for them, and that things are moving, and that they're not, that their lives are less disrupted because these institutions that we depend on are actually able to accomplish their mission and create value for their stakeholders.
Well, it's interesting. That's an interesting example, because that's one last year when I was, you were on one, I hosted a number of webinars about how people were approaching like all the disruptive change. And that was a theme that I heard again and again. It was very often someone, not like the CEO, who said, let's do this. Sometimes it was, but very often it was someone in the organization. They may have been a management position and some of them not. And they had an idea and they had an approach. And, ultimately the ones that, they were allowed free rein by the leaders and given a budget or given whatever to get that done. I think that's a huge piece of new organizations, like you said, is having more of an open structure and less of a top-down military style.
Right. I think that's exactly right on. It's decentralized decision-making. And I think it's actually, I try to strike optimistic tones in the book. And my message to leaders is that exactly what you just said. Most companies actually have these people already in their company. They have people that practice human-centered design. They have people that fundamentally understand, sort of good agile. They have entrepreneurial people. They have people that are doing startups on the side. And so the positive of this is that they actually already have this expertise inside their organization, and they need to democratize some of it. They need to learn how to apply it, like where to apply it and when to apply it. And they need to create sort of these layers of structure, because the moment you decentralize the decision-making, the communications flow changes, right? So top down, it's sort of one way. It's, the leader with a megaphone on top of the mountain. But when you decentralize this, now you actually have to purposely create communications flow that gets that information back up the chain to leadership so that they can change priorities or, sort of help prioritize back down. And the information needs to go horizontally across the organization, so other parts of the organization understand what's being learned, what are the insights, what are the results of the experiment, what are the data. And so it's one of the things that I think I haven't seen in a lot of the quote unquote agile organizations is the purposeful data flow that needs to change and the communications flow that needs to change. But fundamentally, you're right. I mean, it's just the issues are raised on the edge. So you have to empower the people that work on the edge to respond to those issues. Back in the lean manufacturing days, which describes the Toyota production system, it was fundamental to lean was that you empowered the factory worker to fix problems, to actually halt the assembly line and fix a problem rather than on the fly create workarounds, so that the downtime wouldn't happen again. And that ends up being a more resilient way of maintaining an assembly line than doing the patchwork just to keep it up 24/7. And so it's the same sort of thing. It's like the people that experience the problem or experience customer issues, those are the ones that need to be empowered to solve those. And that actually will increase your understanding of customers and your ability to create features for products and understand where new products might be able to work. And it's there's a lot of trends, I think, inside of corporates that is going that way. But I think it needs to be accelerated, and I don't think it should be, sort of siloed. These are not one-offs. It's really a fundamental shift in the way people think and work. And I guess the other thing I would throw in there, it's applied internally too. It's not just external products. It's fixing processes. It's HR can do this, and IT can do this, like we discussed earlier. The finance group can do this. All of these people have customers. They're colleagues essentially, and they're providing services to those colleagues, and they can improve those services. They can use existing technology to vastly improve them, and they can run experiments to try to figure out if they're doing it the right way. So it's a mindset, again, that really everybody inside the organization can adopt.
How do you change that mindset? Like, how do you change from a culture where the CEO has his thing that he does and that's passed down, and then the next group have their things and then that's passed down, and everyone kind of is the notch in the cog, to an organization where everyone's intrinsically motivated and they not only raise their hands, but they're prone to action and just fixing things without having to bubble things up. Like,
it's
how
hard.
do you do that?
Yeah, it's hard. It's a long journey. to me, the fundamental part, it's sort of a pincer move. And so the management has to decide, we are going to do this differently.
Mm-hmm.
My recommendation is that they don't go and hire a massive consulting firm, because the type of change that those massive consulting firms tends to be top down, and that won't work. Because what we have to do to get to the real fundamental change is behavior change. Mm-hmm. And so again, they already have people that know how to do this. So you can hire outside help. I'm not dissing outside help. You can hire agencies, but you also have people that can do this. And what you start with is management saying, yes, we're going to fundamentally change the behavior. And from the grassroots, from the bottom up, the ground up, we're empowering people to run experiments, to understand their customers, to use evidence to help make decisions. And so I like this concept of an impactathon is what I call it. And basically it's like a 2-day hackathon, but what you're doing is applying those principles, the 5 E's: empathy, exploration, equilibrium, evidence-based decision-making, and ethics, and applying that to solving internal problems, solving the problems of leadership, asking leaders, what keeps you up at night? What's something that we can actually solve that it'll drive near-term impact in the organization? And so essentially what you're doing is you're getting the ground level to practice this behavior. So the top, we are going to change. The bottom, start practicing the change. And then that's actually the way to kickstart, I think, this fundamental change. The leaders get to see that, wait a second, we do have the people that can do this, that this mindset actually does drive near-term impact. And that's actually what starts creating the momentum, is seeing that it can be done, seeing that we have the people that can do this, and that can actually increase the efficiency and productivity in your core business. It doesn't have to be innovation that's 5 or 6 or 7 years down the road. It can actually improve the business practices today.
Yeah, I like that. I liked your idea of sort of moving from like kickstarting some kind of change, right, to then accelerating the change that works and then scaling it, across the organization. And then obviously endure is the final phase. But I don't know, maybe you want to talk about that a little.
Well, we should probably hop over to questions, but just this last comment on that is that everybody wants to plan, right? Mm-hmm. It's endless planning. And so the idea is that you could start and run one of these hackathons. Companies could actually do that this weekend if they really wanted to. And there's a lot of experts out there. There's a website, impactathon.com, that actually is free to like download sort of a do-it-yourself kit for that. And you could literally start it this weekend. And I think you would drive impact in the business. And then, it's just start practicing that behavior. And then you're eating your own dog food, right? You're actually applying the principles for rolling out the principles, which means that you're doing it in a way that it's just a massive experiment, and you're iterating on it before you try to scale it, right? Just like we do in the startup world. So yeah, what do you think? Do we hop that? Should we go to questions?
Yeah, we already have 2 questions here, and honestly, I have a question too if we have time.
Awesome.
So we do have. So Drew, we heard you talk about the 5 E's and empathy. Brant, could you speak a little bit more about the additional E's?
Yeah, sorry, we sort of ran through that, right? So empathy, understanding our customers deeply. When we're applying it internally, it's understanding our colleagues, the people that work for us, as well as people understanding the leadership deeply. That actually will help you understand what you need to do to get the budget you want, for example. Exploration. So that's admitting that we don't know, and then being willing to go out and figure it out. And that's learning and running experiments and that sort of thing. Evidence. So that's leveraging data to cut through our biases. So it's insights plus results from the experiments. And we don't want the data to make decisions for us. Those algorithms can go down the wrong path, to be honest. But it's a great way to cut through, whenever there's a dilemma or whatever, we can understand the data that we'd be willing to look at to help us inform our decision. Equilibrium, which is this balance, this idea of balancing the execution based upon what we know with the exploration work that we need to go and learn. We need to go figure it out. And again, this is sort of a continuum that exists across the enterprise. There's some people that have, relatively little uncertainty, and so they're doing relatively little exploration. And then, if you've got your innovation group that's trying to figure out that, what does banking look like in 10 years, there's massive amounts of uncertainty. So there's more exploration work, but they want to start getting to the execution work too. And then the final E, which I hate to give short thrift to, but I think it's super important, is that it's in this day and age, we need to build ethics into the behavior that we're doing inside these corporations. And I think, just huge percentage, massive majority of the people that we work with inside of large organizations, the evil corporations, the massive majority of these people want to live meaningful lives. They have their own personal values. They want to be ethical. They want to contribute to the world. And so we just need to empower them to do that. And the way we do that is we take those highfalutin values that exist on the webpage and we boil it down into actual behaviors that we expect, and how to make decisions about what appropriate behavior is. And we build it into the missions that we give to teams. So those are the 5 E's. And again, everybody needs to practice them, I believe, inside the court.
Absolutely. I really see a lot of, when you were talking about before about knowing and admitting when you're wrong, I really see that tying in with the exploration side of that. It's almost like a taking down an ego, like replacing the E of ego with the E of exploration. I really like that.
Well, what's interesting, there's just a lot of great new leadership books and those type of things. I'm a big fan of Brene Brown's Dare to Lead. And it talks about those type of leadership qualities that are required in this age. And it includes vulnerability and empowering other people and empathy. And we can bring that to the table as leaders in the 21st century. And it's just absolutely vital. And what I'm trying to do, I think, is here's a very specific way that you can apply those things, which is often the tough thing to do. You do workshops and you learn how to, like, what those behaviors mean, but how do you actually apply it in your day-to-day work?
Absolutely. What we can do too is let's move on to our next question as we round up here. Ron points out that the example of the blockchain startup and the school system touched on a really big issue. We are so caught up in these old systems that we need to change, but where do we start? So like management is a part of this old mindset, and we keep on pushing past, like pushing to keep these like best practices. How can we like deconstruct what really is a best practice? Like where do we start with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think so that's a great example if one was running one of these impactathons, right? So somebody could bring a challenge that has to do with that. Like, how do we make, I'm not big on incorporating technology into a channel. Like, how do we bring blockchain into something? We want to be solution agnostic at the beginning, but a challenge could be, and a matter of fact, a school system could do this as a hackathon that's open to startups. And if it's funded by government, maybe even from federal grants, right? There's a great organization called Right to Start that really is trying to get funding for, the massive amounts of grants that go down to the state and city level often don't go to the entrepreneurial community. And so here's a great example. So forget for a moment that the Los Angeles with their budgets have to figure out how to do this. The city runs a hackathon, and the hackathon actually awards prizes and maybe brings in some investors to see if we can get any startups invested. And one of the challenges is, how do we build this app so it's more resilient and redundant and all of those type of things? And what other challenges do other agencies inside the city government face that we can actually try to create a startup community around solving those issues using federal money. So that would be one way to tackle it. Inside the big corporations, it really is just, again, it gets back to that we need to tackle the internal issues. We focus on digital transformation and innovation, and everybody's thinking about 5-10 years down the road, or how do we create a mobile app. Some of the leading companies in the world that have these great innovation centers, and you can go take tours around all of the great technology that they're involved with, and yet their back-end systems are 30 years old. We have to be able to apply that mindset everywhere inside the company, because that's where those challenges are. And so if we just keep that mindset out on the, serving new products, coming down the pipe, we're never going to fix those. Those companies actually can't be more resilient than their weakest link inside their companies. And so we have to turn that stuff internal. And it's really where I think the innovation industry has not served corporations well, because all they want to do is focus on, this isn't future proofing. I'm not future proofing an organization. I'm disruption proofing. How do they survive these continuous disruptions?
Actually, that ties into the question that I kind of had, and it's like a question also just kind of like hitting on another point that really struck me, was how you're disrupting this narrative that redundancy is bad. So like we're taught a lot in business that like if it's redundant, get rid of it. And you're saying, no, redundancy is safety. Redundancy is what's going to keep you afloat when you have a disruption. We need to keep that. It's safer for you. It's safer for all of us. And I was wondering kind of like how you've done that in your own business, right? So is it with Move the Needle, correct?
Yeah, moves the needle.
Yeah, sorry, Moves the Needle.
Yeah.
How have you done that? Like, how have you kind of like bolstered up redundancy in your own work?
Yeah, I boy, what a question. I'm not sure that I have. A service-based business is a little bit, we're sort of built to be dynamic. Like, so we eat our own dog food in the sense that we're always talking to our customers, but we're also always running experiments. And so if you're a product company, running an experiment can be difficult because you're trying to figure out, well, what's the behavior of my stakeholder I need to test when I don't have a product? Whereas a service, I can go like, well, here's a service we might add, and I can run an experiment literally by going and just trying to sell that service. And if nobody buys it, then I know it's not going to work. But what really taught me about redundancy is when I was an IT manager. So my first jobs out of college, way back before there were IT degrees, and computers and networks were just starting to get into, to smaller businesses. I was an IT guy, and we never had redundancy until we had a disaster, right? And I think this happened in at least two of the businesses that I was involved with. Something crashes, you have an electrical storm, the power goes out, and suddenly all of your data that you've kept on these servers is wiped. And your boss comes and says, well, where are the backups? And I'm all like, backups, what? And so a lot of the redundancy failover and these backup systems, a lot of that stuff was just kind of emerging. And so IT managers like myself were maybe lazy and behind the times, and you get taught that lesson once, right? I mean, it's like you don't get a second chance at that one. From a technology perspective, a lot of redundancy is already built into things like the cloud now and that sort of thing, and the blockchain that Drew's been talking about brings redundancy to a whole different level. And so there's just no doubt that this is going to get into all of our products eventually. But yeah, no, it's a funny question. Like, how do you do this yourself? Well, we run a lot of experiments.
Okay, well, I think that's all the questions we have. It's a few minutes early, but if we didn't have anything else, I guess we could call it a night. It's already, the sun has set in the background of all of us, as you've noted.
Yeah, right. Yep.
No, right. Well, it has been an honor having you for my second event with Chevaliers. I want to give a special shout out to our audience for the great questions and for sticking through with us. Don't forget to pre-order a signed copy with a bookplate copy using the link that I've been dropping throughout. If you want to get a copy, delve more into it, kind of study up on your own. Also, we will, as I mentioned, I will be sharing the recording. We've been recording onto the cloud. Redundancy, so that we can share it later. Yeah, and I'll just look out for that like in the upcoming days. Probably tomorrow morning is when I'll put it together. But yeah, thanks for, this has been great. This has been so nice, and have a great night, everybody.
Yeah, so thanks. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Have a good one.
Fun chat.